I think can be cut is defense. Just look at that. You know what that red bar is? Of course, the red bar is US defense spending. They should, like this picture, should give you an idea of what's going on. This red bar is US defense spending. The source is NATO. And where I got it from, it is Hane, H-A-N-N-E, Cochlear, C-O-K-E-L-A-E-R-E. Okay, so, come on. You're spending an absurd amount on defense. This should be obvious. So the US is spending in this chart, in this graph, it is 965. The next one is Germany at 98, and then UK at 82. The US just has this thing, you know, we are the defenders of the free world, etc., and therefore we need to spend this money on defense. But you don't want to do that when there are people suffering at the grocery store. You can't do that when there is an increasing inequality and people are being pushed into more and more financial stress. They voted for you because they were in financial stress. If you show this picture to the ones who voted saying that they were experiencing financial stress, what do you think they would say? What would those voters say? The second largest is China at 228 billion. But remember one thing. Then you compare the spending with China. Firstly, China is not like, they're not crazy. They're not going to start a war with the US. Okay. Secondly, US has allies who are also spending hundreds of billions. I mean, the total is like hundreds of billions of dollars, right? So this can definitely be a cut, this red bar, right? It can be, even if you make it half or even 1/3, you're so far ahead of everybody else. If you cut it by half, then you're saving about 484 billion a year. You know, what does 484 billion a year get you? It can actually get you 25% food affordability program. That is when somebody walks into the store and then they spend $30 buying food, then the government could pay $7.50 and their price at the store would fall from $30 to $22.50. It's not only the defense budget which is spent per year, but you look at this, what has been happening over the past few decades. The Iraq and Syria wars cost anywhere between 0.79 trillion and 3 trillion. So the combined total for this war is somewhere between, it could be up to like 7 trillion. $7 trillion have been spent on this war, and what have these wars got for the US? So compare the cost of these wars at somewhere like, let's say, 4,000 billion to 7,000 billion to a food affordability program which at 10% would cost only 185 billion. The US is at least 10 times stronger than any potential adversary. Okay. And if you cut it by like 50%, you'll still be 5 times stronger. And however, if you cut the thing and you have like, let's say a 20% food affordability program, the grocery bill would fall from $50 to $40. Now you have to understand that the defense budget is not only about defending the country. Here is here is an article, and this is by Valerie Encina, and it's in Breaking Defense. And what they're saying is that this former Air Force Secretary Frank Kendall says that we want to stop buying C-130s. Please, we have got enough of these C-130s. Then why is the C-130 still being bought? Because whenever these large defense programs are there is some representative or some senator whose whichever state they are in, they spend a lot of money is being spent there, so they are completely opposed to any cuts in those programs. Now you have to decide. You have to let these representatives and senators keep spending money on these unnecessary programs, or you can have food affordability and income fairness. If you really live in a state where there's a lot of defense spending, come on, I mean, think about the entire country and think about how you would benefit at the store if that spending was cut. This famous book, which I should mention, it's by General Smedley Butler. He was a Marine general, and he has a book called What is a Racket? Don't Fall for That Racket. It's like, why do we need all this spending? Well, it's always the same story. And they first start out by saying, dictator X is a threat to democracy and freedom, and we need $100 billion to fight him. And very soon that $100 billion becomes $200 billion, and before you know it, it's in trillions of dollars. Okay. So when one politician tells you that, you should say, no thanks. Spend that $100 billion instead on food affordability and income fairness. Every time the same thing happens, okay? They start by labeling a foreign leader as a non-democratic dictator who kills his domestic opponents. What this totally ignores is that a foreign leader who kills his domestic opponents, is that a good enough reason to go to war against that dictator? There are 50 countries which also have dictators, and some of them are absolutely brutal. They just do anything to keep power. And the US does business with them and often provides them protection. So what is happening is that these ideas of democracy and freedom are being used as excuses, as an insincere justification for more conflict. The war lobby loves it. Their goal is to have more and more wars, so more spending on defense, but the more you spend on defense, the less you have for food affordability and income fairness. So nothing should be spent on these before food affordability and income fairness are fully funded. Okay, take this case of this F-35. It's trillions of dollars. Okay. Now they're saying that the US Government Accountability Office says that the F-35 will cost $2 trillion. That's 2,000 billion. More than 10 years of food affordability at 10%. Or 6 years of food affordability. When that food affordability is not paid, it means that basically the government is not paying the part of your food bill which it was supposed to pay. That is how it should work in a fair economic system. There should be some relation between the hours you work, and it should not just be the free market determined pay. There should be some relation between the hours you work. Like, you're working two jobs and you're finding it difficult to pay for your food. Like, you're working, like, let's say 40 hours a week. And when you work 40 hours a week, let's say the wage that you've been given is $20 an hour, and that is a market determined wage, which is not a fair wage. And to make that fair, the government needs to give you another, from $20 an hour, they need to give you another, let's say, $16 an hour, so that you don't stress about finances. You're working, you have spent, you're working hard, you're spending so much time on your work, and still you're financially stressed. That's not fair. So we live in a democracy, and in a democracy, the government has the power to raise your income to $36 an hour, and that is what you want. And that's what the government should be doing. And the government at the moment is not doing that. It's not doing the income fairness program. So you need income fairness. Okay, and then you have Musk saying that F-35 stealth fighter, and believe it, it probably is true. Technology changes wars very quickly. You start the Second World War, you have these, First World War, you have these battleships, okay? And then, like, you put more armor on the battleships, and you put bigger guns on the battleships, and then these massive battleships were built. And Japan had two of these largest battleships. I think one was the Yamato, and one of them, was sunk at Midway, the Battle of Midway, and then the other was sent up on a suicide mission. Thousands of lives lost. And what happened? How was the one at Midway sunk? It was sunk by aircraft. What is aircraft? Aircrafts are an advance in technology. They are smaller, but they can deliver that killing blow. The Battle of Midway is actually fought entirely by aircraft, and it was just devastated the Japanese. 4 aircraft carriers gone, one of the biggest battleships gone. So you have to realize that technology changes war. And what we're seeing now in the Ukraine war is the thing that okay, on land, what was the thing which was so had a very significant effect? It was tanks. And so the US went ahead and it built these very massive tanks, actually. They weigh I think 70 pounds, Abrams. But you send that Abrams into the war at Ukraine, what happens is that a small drone with a bomb comes and disables it and then destroys it. So what is the direction in which wars are moving? They're moving towards smaller, more accurate, and that manifested itself in the Second World War as aircrafts sinking battleships, and now in this Ukraine war, it's being manifested as drones destroying tanks. Okay, So yes, F-35, it is a very expensive program. Not sure how much it is worth, or if it's worth anything at all. It may just go the way of the Japanese battleships. So, then, like, they're just straight up lying. Straight up lying to have these wars. And here's a article by Gershoff and Kushner in Perspectives on Politics, and they say that we suggest the principal reason that 3/4 of the American public supported the Iraq War was that the Bush administration successfully convinced them that a link existed between Saddam Hussein and terrorism generally, and between Saddam Hussein and Al Qaeda specifically. But of course, people who are senior in the government knew that there was no link because, the Baath Party was actually a secular party. Saddam was a terrible dictator, no doubt. But the Baath Party was, when it started, and it was there in Syria, it was there in Iraq, it was actually a secular movement. So they were not based on religion. Whereas Al Qaeda was totally based on religion. So this link between Al Qaeda and Saddam was very strained. There was actually no link. But there were all these insinuations about Saddam and Al Qaeda and how they were really together. And that's what shaped the public opinion. And I think at some point, about 70% of the public believed that Saddam had links to Al Qaeda. And of course, which after 9/11 totally justified in the public's mind, justified the Iraq War. And what came out of it? Thousands of Americans and Europeans dead, and hundreds of thousands of Iraqis dead. But the media and the leadership which pushed these wars, editorials on national newspapers, news reports about yellow cake and high-strength aluminum tubes on front pages of national newspapers. Were they ever held accountable for all that? The disaster that was the Iraq War in terms of people dead and the $1 trillion lost? No. So generally speaking, the establishment wings of both parties, it's very funny. I think Glenn Greenwald had this thing that one of the strangest things in American politics. I think I was talking about maybe 2015 or so. He said one of the strangest things about American politics is that those who were the major proponents of the Iraq War, they were thought leaders in the media and in politics, they quite effortlessly moved and became the thought leaders of the liberals. It was very strange. If you are experiencing financial stress, if you are getting paid $20 an hour and not $36 an hour, don't fall for these lies to incite more and more wars. Yeah, so what about China and Russia, which are, the supposedly the greatest adversaries of the US? Russia's GDP is about 2 trillion and they're spending about 8% on defense, so it's about 160 billion. way lower than 960 billion which the US spends. And China is spending a bit more, but still US is far ahead of them in terms of defense spending, and the US defense budget can easily be cut without any danger. And remember, US has allies like Germany, Britain, France, etc., right? And who also have very large defense budgets. Now, hostility towards China and Russia is promoted by the mainstream media, but it only gives us a partial picture of what the reality is for these countries. The Chinese Communist Party and Putin are like bad dictators. Yeah, they are dictators, it's known. They are not perfect. However, if you have a complete picture about these countries, you realize that they have also done a lot of good for their countries. And they therefore, because they've done good for their countries, they have a lot of support. So what good have they done? Okay, China's economic growth during the past 5 decades is incontestable. The thing which happened with China, which did not happen to the Soviet Union, is the Soviet Union said, let's do political reform first, let's get rid of this dictatorship, and then we will think about economic growth and such like. China went the other way. They said, the Communist Party said, we're going to keep power because we are afraid of anarchy. And we are going to introduce reforms to our economy and let there be, a free market. But of course, the political power is retained by the Communist Party. So yes, they're entrepreneurs, and they gave security to investors, very important. And they received a huge amount of investments therefore, because they had this high quality, low cost labor. So naturally a lot of investment came flooding in. So they did it right. And as a result, now they are far wealthier than they were when they started. And the people appreciate that. So there's reason why the Chinese Communist Party is popular in China. Similarly, when you think of Russia, you cannot ignore what happened during the Yeltsin years. Yeltsin was essentially a drunkard and just like anarchy, economic collapse. It became like everything was failing. I can't say it off the top of my head, but I think the nominal per capita GDP from 2000 to and 20 years later or 25 years later, I think the increase in the nominal GDP is about 10%. You should check it. I'm not sure it's 10 times, not 10%, 900%. So Putin rescued Russia from the anarchy and economic collapse of the Yeltsin years. So he has reason to be popular in Russia. Of course, he's a dictator, and a lot of people are opposed to him having this dictatorial power. So they oppose him. Yeah, that it's true, but just don't kind of think that all Russians don't like Putin or they don't appreciate the fact that he rescued the country from the Yeltsin years. So stop worrying about Russia and China and think about the US. Fix the domestic problems. Okay, don't try to it's not necessary to go and try to fix other countries. Let's first fix our own country. Okay, so if we could make China and Russia American allies for achieving common goals and benefit humanity, of course, one of the big goals for our next 1,000 years is exploiting the resources of space. So if we can work with them, that's wonderful. It'll get us there faster. And if you really can't work with them, at least don't make them into enemies. That's stupidity.